A new report out of the New York Times says that Bob Iger, of all of the problems he had at the Walt Disney Company, felt like he was underpaid and he hated answering to shareholders. Let's talk about that on That Park Place. He often complained to Mr. Chapek and board members about his compensation. It was a frequent source, this is talking about Bob Iger, it was a frequent source of tension between him and Susan Arnold, who sat on the compensation committee for many years. Mr. Iger pointed repeatedly to Les Moonves, the chief executive of CBS, who was paid more than him, even though CBS was a much smaller and who was much smaller and less complex. In 2017, Mr. Moonves made $70 million. Mr. Iger, $37 million, barely half that. One Disney director called it Moonves envy. In 2018, shareholders rejected Mr. Iger's compensation in a non-binding vote. Disney won approval in 2019 only after Mr. Iger agreed to a smaller package. But then a year later, he ends up getting this $142 million pay package, which, by the way, Bob Iger sold most of his shares in the company when Bob Chapek had gotten it all the way up to $200 a share.
Yeah, it was about 220 or 210, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So Mr. Iger pondered a conversation he'd had with Steve Jobs shortly before the Apple co-founder died in 2011. Mr. Jobs had urged Mr. Iger not to stay so long at Disney that he ended up depriving himself of some of the great things life had to offer. I'm going to say that Bob Iger wants to have his cake and eat it too. He wants all the great things. I'm going to say
that this is the great things life have to offer for him. And all of the yachts and all of the Willow Bays aren't enough, you know. That's all. I am sure that if those were the words that Jobs used, which of course we don't know, he was met with a bemused smile that said, like what? Because this is his thing.
Right. And I want to wrap up.
And if he was as good at it as his desire would make him be, great. That's what you want. You know, I often talk about, I once had a medical procedure that they kept you awake for, even though they were doing it to you. And the doctor that I had, who was so good, as he fixed something, you heard him talking. He said, yeah, that's the way it ought to be. And I thought, thank God I got a guy who's enthusiastic, as opposed to one who just says, next, and collects the check. You know, so there's good things about that. But it also implies that being that enthusiastic, you actually are good at it.
Yeah.
Oops.
Right. I just keep imagining.
As opposed to being, that's why, because you're so good, they call you in to fix all the mistakes of the guy that got the stock up to $220 a share.
Right. And essentially you're correct. At this point, it's apparent that Bob Iger's only move is buying other people's companies and riding their success for another 10 years. Much in the way that the Disney company ended up ruining the Muppets over a long period of time. Pixar, they bring in Lasseter.
And that's what J.P. Morgan did. And, you know, he sees himself as a captain of industry, not a creative.
At least with the Muppets, when Eisner bought the Muppets, what they were really buying was Jim Henson. They were buying Jim Henson's creativity. Yes. Jim Henson was still going to be in charge of the Muppets. Yep. So it was basically just going to be the same thing under the Disney umbrella. And Jim was also going to become, you know, a part of Imagineering essentially and start working on other attractions and things like that. So
fill in the name Lasseter and you got the same story.
It wasn't until Jim Henson didn't go to the doctor that all of a sudden now we don't know what to do with the Muppets.
Right.
I think it's a fascinating story, and it's a great soap opera, and it's an example of people with egos. But this is America in 2024. They're a dime a dozen.
We've got one more point I want to make after we get to here. Vash, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, this is what Bob Iger is really obsessed with, right? He's obsessed with, oh, hey, you know, look at my photo here with Paul McCartney, or look at my yacht, look at the great design there.
No, it's more than that, and it explains something very important. He wants to be known as the guy that bought 20th Century Fox, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
The question is not, yeah, but how much did you pay for it, and how much did the Universal people push you into it and cost you a lot more money you should have spent.
Right.
It's the accomplishment for him is not I bought it right. It's I bought it.
Yes, and I think he wants to be known as the guy who broke the glass ceiling for the Walt Disney Company too. This is why I'm pretty stuck on Dana Walden, is because it's too tantalizing for that to be the case. He talks about how he makes fun of Eisner for not able to get the high-end restaurant reservation. I mean, it's just absurd stuff. But please go ahead, Jonas.
No,
it's like go on Zillow and find a nice house you'd like and see that the asking price is $400,000, let's say. He's the guy who comes in and says, I'll pay you $6. And then I'll tell people, I'm the guy that bought a $600,000 house in that neighborhood where they were all $4, because as they appreciate, I'll be ahead of the game. No, you'll be the schmuck who came up with an extra $200,000. And, he plays the game on a different set of rules than anybody else. And when he breaks the rules that have worked for 100 years, like not doing 43 restakes because you got it right the first time, because you waited till it was right before you went and put the cameras on it. That's not a plus. That's not if the movie does well, that's not a plus. If the movie sells 8 trillion tickets, that's still wrong. But hey, I'm the deal maker. Mm-hmm. I'm the pro from Dover. I'm the wheeler dealer.
He's the weatherman.
Well, he's now the walrus. Goo goo gajoob. Or the hippo, at least.
Now,
anyway.
I do want to talk about this here because it's relevant to the Chapek thing we talked about earlier. When the company's board met in December of 2019, Iger broached the idea of stepping back, but not leaving entirely. Why don't we accelerate the process, Mr. Iger said. Mr. Chapek was his choice to succeed him. Mr. Iger told the board that Mr. Chapek knew the brand well, respected it, and would do no harm. And this is, of course, where he differs from Bob Iger, who I'm not sure if he knows what the Disney brand is, if I can be frank. He also said Mr. Chapek had great integrity. I believe that. One of Disney's directors, Mark Parker, had recently decided to step down as chief executive of Nike and become executive chairman. Mr. Iger pitched doing the same thing. That model would allow him to stay at Disney for the remainder of his contract, doing what he liked best, overseeing the company's creative endeavors, because Bob Iger views himself as a creative executive. Mr. Chapek would become the CEO and handle everything else. A crucial element was that all the division leaders would report to Mr. Chapek, but Mr. Chapek would report to Mr. Iger, leaving Mr. Iger ultimately in charge. There was an obvious financial incentive as well. Mr. Iger still had more than $100 million in unvested stock options, and his leadership could help protect its value. Safra Catz, chief executive of Oracle and Disney board member, pushed back. Why make Mr. Chapek chief executive rather than chief operating officer? Iger said he didn't want a rerun of the situation with Mr. Staggs, in which people thought Mr. Staggs was merely auditioning for the top job and they could outmaneuver him by going to Mr. Iger. So Bob Iger wanted to make it clear that he wasn't making the same foolish mistake that he did in the past. And again, to go back to my favorite of Steven Spielberg's films, he's making all new mistakes here.
Yes, yeah. Making all new ones. No, it's absolutely the case, and it's so weird to me. It's like, why the rush? Why do you want to step out? Is it really because you don't like being the CEO in terms of, handling the earnings calls or
having to do all that CEO stuff? That
right? Yeah. Or are you looking to just bail on the company at its most crucial point? Go ahead, Lou.
Well, the obvious point to me is this shows that, at least to some degree, maybe not as flamboyantly or as charmingly, Chapek has the same disease. Because if you come to him and you say, listen, I'm preparing to move you up, you're my choice, and then you come back and say, hey, in 3 weeks, we're announcing you're my choice and I'm still there and you're second to me, isn't Chapek faced with, well, let's see, what do? Do I take this deal and get what I've always wanted, the title? Or do I say, I don't want to do it that way, Bob. If I'm the boss, I should be the boss, and get told, well, that's the deal, take it or leave it. And you have 3 weeks because we're announcing it.
Right.
So it continues to astound me. And that's what this article just reminded me of, being so astounded at. How little these guys knew each other. How totally blind
the fact that they had worked together for decades.
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of the ego problem too. If your outlook is whatever's right for me is right for me, you don't really care what the other guy thinks or will do.
Thanks for watching That Park Plays News. For more information, consider checking out www.thatparkplace.com. And don't forget to subscribe, share, like, and send this out on your favorite social media accounts.